Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I feel like I've already learned quite a lot. I think what Isabel's presentation particularly has underlined for me is that there's such a personal consequence of what we've all just been through, and you can empathise with it fully. So my name's Kate Shoesmith. I'm from the Recruitment and Employment Federation. For those of you who don't know us, we're the professional membership body for UK recruitment industry. It's an industry which supports people into work. So every 21 seconds, somebody gets a new permanent job when they're working with a recruiter. It's also worth noting, of course, that there is a large proportion of agency workers, temporary contract freelancers that are supported by recruiters. On any given day, there's roughly about 1 million people that are working in that way in the UK. And we do an awful lot of work in terms of supporting people from unemployment into employment. 300,000 people move from unemployment into a job with a recruiter every year, and 100,000 young people get their first new job opportunity when they work with a recruiter. So there's a real understanding of what's happening in the labour market on that front line. And what I wanted to start with today was to share some information and data about what we see from the jobs market before going on to some of the policy reflections of what we've learned from the time of being on furlough. So first off, I wanted to just show you exactly what we see in terms of recruitment activity whenever there is anything that is a seismic shift in the economy, in politics, but also a pandemic in terms of the activity in the jobs market. This graph tracks recruitment activity by both permanent recruitment into permanent jobs, and into temporary jobs. And it's a study that we've done for nearly 25 years now. It's done by IHS Markit for us, who do the PMI, so the productivity indices. So quite a familiar agency in that regard. So what we can see is every single time that, as I said, there's something big that occurs, the jobs market has an immediate impact. And so data like this is often used by government departments to track what, as a lead indicator of what will be coming in terms of the jobs market. It's used by the Bank of England as well for that exact reason, because it's it's an instantaneous response to what's going to happen in the labour market, whereas the ONS is looking at the quarter before. So we can see the impact that the financial crash of 2007, 8, 9 had on the economy. This here is the double dip. If I just come over here, this is the EU referendum, where we saw that there was a decline in hiring activity, and you can absolutely see how there was a huge decline in hiring activity once the pandemic hit. We saw it almost instantaneously. To break that down into what we saw in terms of permanent roles, I've highlighted across here what happened in terms of April and May. Anything below a rate of 50 means a contraction. We've never seen contractions like this in the jobs market. Now, clearly the activity has recovered, and we've all been talking about how there's such a huge demand for labour and skills right now. It doesn't take much to see the newspaper headlines about driver shortages, about people working in IT, of course, talking about health and care services. But we'd never seen declines in activity quite like this for both permanent roles, but also for temporary. And the reason for sharing this is that meant that businesses simply paused and stopped hiring as soon as the pandemic struck, which means that without something like the furlough scheme, most employers were saying that they were going to be looking to reduce headcount and to reduce their staffing pools. They felt that they would have no choice but to do that because activity had decline generally in terms of production activity, and we saw that across the board, didn't we? So the reason that we and others really pushed government into a scheme like the job retention scheme, and they were extremely receptive, to be fair, was that we felt that this was we would need something if we were to shore up those jobs, and we were to make sure that the unemployment rates didn't hit the massive highs. At one point, the Bank of England were talking about a 15% unemployment rate by the end of 2020 into 2021. And really and truly, the economic consequences of that would be felt far and wide. So the job retention scheme felt like a really positive step, building on those examples of what we had seen had worked in Europe. And you saw that earlier in Christoph's presentation about where we'd seen that there was evidence of such schemes being used to good effect. And it did have an impact in terms of that business's intention to hire and their plans for their workforce. So just one last slide from me is every month we produce something called Jobs Outlook, which asks employers about their hiring intention in the short to mid-term. And this one's done for us by Savanta Comres. It's a pool of over 600 employers, HR hiring managers. And we survey them monthly, and we aggregate the data quarterly. So what we saw here is actually that in terms of a business's intention to consider whether there was whether they would be reducing their workforce, what furlough clearly did is there was no mass change between how they felt in January before the pandemic started in 2020 and how they felt by the end of the year. And that was the true positives in terms of that business hiring intention. And it's very clear from the data that we collect, but also the anecdotal evidence, the qualitative side of talking to employers, that they wouldn't have been able to maintain their workforces without that government support and that government intervention. So I'm very happy for this data and these slides to be shared post presentation so that people can do a bit more digging and ask any further questions on that. But what I wanted to really come on to was the data's there that we think furlough did what it needed to do, and you've heard from Christoph and Isabel about the support it provided to individuals, but it wasn't without its issues, and there were consequences for that. One of the things that we particularly noticed from the furlough scheme is that in the very earliest stages, it was quite difficult to get to grips with furlough as a business applying for it. There's obviously administrative procedures that need to be gone through, and that's important because you need to ensure that there's proper checks and balances for the use of public money. But that administration side, that's something where it would be really useful to evaluate how could we improve on that in the future. But a particular point from our side was there was less consideration of how the furlough scheme could be used for people working in a atypical way, so not your permanent full-time employees. It was available to be used by where it was possible by people working on an agency contract in some instances, but the scheme wasn't designed with that in mind, of course, and some of the administrative processes we had to do and go through to double check that the scheme would work for those people that actually really required the support was a very important part of it. So reviewing that would be so important. And we've mentioned at the very start of today how furlough wasn't available for those that were self-employed or limited company directors. And given that this is a growing proportion of our population, and it's the case that people are choosing to work in different ways other than being full-time employed, we need to consider that the labour market is in quite a different place than perhaps where it was even 5, 10, 20 years ago. We see that increasing numbers of people are choosing to work in different ways. we particularly see that young people, while they're studying, will obviously, or they're seeking to gain new skills, they will work in a more temporary or flexible way. At the other end of the jobs market, we see people who are seeking to, they're getting to the end of their careers in one industry, they're seeking to change where they work or how they work and reduce their hours. And we see that that's a really important area. And you only have to look at the levels of economic inactivity post-pandemic as we move into this stage, where you can see that there's a growing group of people that are over 50 and 55 years old who are opting out of the jobs market. And that's got significant consequences for our labour market right now, particularly when we're continuing to talk about labour shortages and skills shortages. So how do we address some of these long-term, more structural trends needs to be all important as part of the policy reflections for examining the furlough scheme and what might we need in the future. It feels like the longer term workforce planning that's going to be required should be at the heart of all of this. And perhaps the final thing for me is that it's a really important point that we're looking at how furlough worked in and of the moment as we are coming out of the pandemic and hopefully entering those final stages. But actually we can see and we can all feel that there are economic headwinds ahead of us. So we've seen over the course of the last 12 months, the surge in prices for materials. We're very aware of the rises in interest rates and what's happening there to aim to control for some of the inflation impacts that we are seeing. And we're aware of things like the national insurance contributions going up in April this year. That clearly those inflationary pressures are going to be high upon all of us, and how businesses respond during this time is going to be all important. So knowing where a scheme that supports the UK economy and the labour market with some of those pressures and forces is perhaps the most important thing. How could such a scheme be considered to be used if we are facing something that will be quite a different economic landscape in 6 months' time to 18 months' time? Because that's when we would want to see, how does such a scheme work in very different settings, and how does it protect and support people that need that protection, whilst also supporting the businesses that are employing so many people in the UK. So I think there's a key need for us to think about the furlough scheme in all its guises, and about whether there's something that we could be doing and learning from, so that we can get the scheme right for those people who are choosing to work in quite a different circumstances to the normal 9 to 5, those people who have to work in that way. And how do we build on that learning so that we ensure that it is a scheme that's fit for purpose when we have different economic forces at play in the future?